Welcome to Reintegrate, the podcast where we discuss the joys and frustrations of trying to live an integrated Christian life. Your hosts are Brendan Romigh and myself, Bob Robinson. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Garber, who has been a wise sage and guru in the faith and work movement for decades. When I was looking for a doctoral program that would help me understand how to be missional in our vocations, he invited me into a doctoral cohort that he and Donald Guthrie were creating at Covenant Theological Seminary. What a blessing it was to be a part of that cohort and for having those two men being the readers of my dissertation. Steve started the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation and Culture. He has mentored scores of pastors and marketplace leaders. He has served as a consultant for foundations and corporations and universities. He has taught at seminaries and colleges. He has written amazing articles and fantastic books. He is married to Meg, and they have 5 children and several grandchildren. One of them has just been born, so they are celebrating in Virginia. His latest book is titled The Seamless Life, a tapestry of love and learning, worship, and work, from InterVarsity Press. 2 of his earlier books also had great, deep impressions upon me and my way of life and the way I do ministry. The first is The Fabric of Faithfulness, weaving together belief and behavior. And the second is Visions of Vocation, Common Grace for the Common Good, both also published by InterVarsity Press. Many of you have heard of Steve Garber and have appreciated his teachings, and you're tuning in because of that. Some of you haven't heard of him, and so you're in for a treat.
Bob, I know that I've previously joked with you about how it seems you tend to pick your heroes to come onto the podcast, but this week you really did pick one of your heroes. And Steve, I'm really looking forward to gleaning whatever wisdom I'm able to. Steve, especially now that I have launched out of college and I'm kind of entering the next level of my adulthood, Bob has told me about some of the insights you have regarding keeping and living a sound faith throughout my post-college years. What things would you specifically recommend for me so that I can keep growing in my faith and reintegrating that with my vocation?
A good question, Brandon. I wish we had time to take a walk together and talk it through more fully. Since Bob knows me very well, and I know him a little bit too, he knows I'm disposed to learn all that's possible to learn from Walker Percy, the novelist, essayist of the 20th century, who said memorably for the ages, you can get all A's and still flunk life. And for somebody who's just finished their university years as you have, I think it's worth remembering that, whatever your GPA turned out to be, and however satisfied you or your parents or your professors were with your work, that on the one hand, it doesn't matter now, because what matters now is what are you going to do with all that? Now that you know, what are you going to do, actually? Which is really the heart question of what vocation means for all of us, I would say, what we do with what you know. And so I think that then it's worth remembering that these next years of your life, from 20 to 30, are going to be years where you're forging, identity, vocation, mission, the very, big words, big ideas that are going to shape who you are for the rest of your life. So these are important years. They're critical years, actually, to be conscious of, to be thoughtful about, to be careful about, to be watchful of, to pray over, to realize, in fact, that, that if you are somebody who at age 21, 22 says, these things matter to me, they're the most important things in my whole life, actually, then the question is really, so who are you becoming now that's going to shape and connect what you say you want to be with who, in fact, you will become?
It seems like so many young people just kind of go with the flow and they don't think through these kinds of things. So right. Is there any more purposeful, any ideas on how to be more purposeful about that?
Well, again, because you and I have been talking for years together, Bob, you know that I have some questions that I think are worth asking and asking again. But one of the questions has two words in it, which are kind of mouthful words, but they're not difficult either. They're good words. But the question's been this: do you have a telos that is sufficient to meaningfully orient your praxis over the course of your life? Now, most of us get along pretty well in life without ever using the words telos and praxis. I don't require that for you or me or anybody else, actually. But they're good words too. They're words to think about. Telos is a word which is why do you get up in the morning? What's the point of your life anyway? What's the purpose of your life? What are you aiming for? What are you living for in your life? Praxis, of course, is what's it look like? How do you work this out day by day? So the question is, is what you say matters most to you? Is that shaping of the way you live your life day by day? Or is there a disconnect? Or is there, by God's grace, a deepening coherence between what you say you care about and how you actually live your life?
It takes some imagination, some vision of vocation. That's a good title. Yeah. But some way to see beyond what is the now. I'm going to. It's like what athletes say: in order to finish the race or win the game, I've got to envision what that finish line looks like, or that game-winning shot looks like. This is my final thing I want to happen.
This isn't a conversation I have every day at all, because you know me well, Bob, but I did go visit Wendell Berry on his farm one time with some business people that I was talking with. And at the end of the long day of conversation, Barry said this to us: if you want to make money for a year, you have to ask certain questions. But you want to make money for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. It was a particular response to our day's discussion with him, which had great meaning and still does 15 years later, I would say, in the project I'm involved on. But I would say in some ways it's wisdom that runs across the whole of life. You want to be married for a year? Well, you have to ask certain questions. You want to be married for 25 years, 50 years? You have to ask other questions, actually. You can do a lot of things for right now. Do you want to feel good today? Okay. But do you want to have a life which satisfies you and seems honest and coherent, 25 years from now? You have to ask other questions, actually.
So Bob used the word vocation multiple times. And I think especially within the context that we're discussing it, it's important to kind of flesh out the definition of vocation. I mean, I know my job, my occupation, which in my case happens to be construction management. But is that the same thing as vocation? And do you think those things can commonly get their definitions mixed up or convoluted by most people?
Another good question, Brandon. I would say, most words that matter very much to us have some fluidity about them. It's not like you have to say these three words to say it exactly right, or then you miss it and you miss the point of your life. I would always distinguish between vocation and occupation, just for conversation's sake and for clarity's sake, I think, for people. Vocation, in my mind, is the deeper, truer, richer, longer word in someone's life. It's what makes Bob Bob and Brandon Brandon and Steve Steve. And you be different than your mom and your dad or your best friend. It isn't that you're not close to them, but you're put together differently. Things that make you be, at age 22, construction manager. It could have been that you were a literature major. It could have been that you were a biologist or something. But there was a certain set of things at age, I would say, probably at age 6 and 7 and 10 and 12 and 14 and 17 and 21, that puts you in a certain direction to think these are things I'm actually more interested in than those things, frankly.
Well, that's, he was a communication major. Okay.
And then people always ask me that. They're like, you do construction? Did you go to college for that? And I say, no, I went to school for communication, which makes me a good actor and a better liar.
No,
That's how I got the job.
Please not, Brandon. Please not. But anyway, I'm just saying that you're uniquely you. And vocation is a word which is like that. Vocation, like all good words, has its own root and history. We use the word vocal cords to speak about I'm able to speak in a way that you can hear me. And vocation comes from the very same Latin root as vocal cord does. And it's essentially saying that something is being said, and we have the ability to hear what's being said. So putting it in the truest, deepest theological way that it must be understood, I would argue. It is that there's a God in the universe, a God who is there, who has spoken, and we have the ability to respond. We have the responsibility, the ability to respond to what's been said to us. Vocation is about that, actually. The occupations of our life grow out of the deeper sense of vocation, which we all have, I think. The occupation is more helpful if we see it as these are the relationships and responsibilities that I occupy at different points of my life, at certain points of my life. So when you were 17, you were not an undergraduate student. When you got to be 18, 19, you were, and you had this particular major with these responsibilities before you. Now that you're 22 and 23, it isn't the same thing. Actually, the occupational setting and context has changed for you. Have you fundamentally changed as a human being? I wouldn't say so. You're still the person who was interested in the same things you probably still are, but you've read more books, you have heard more lectures, you've thought about things more, you had maybe more work experiences. So I would say occupation is most helpfully seen when we speak about it as these are the relationships and responsibilities that I occupy along the way of my life as my vocation is being unfolded over time.
So your books, Steve, have been talking about, used as that metaphor of weaving fabric together, even seamlessness, the seamless life. This ministry, this podcast, we call it Reintegrate, this integration of life. Every podcast here, we try to help the people who understand this key word, reintegrate. So from your vantage point, what does that word mean, reintegrate?
So again, Bob, it's a longer conversation to have, but the first time I taught anything at Regent College, there was a summer school course a few years ago, and there was a couple from Sydney, Australia, in the week-long course. It was a course on the Visions of Vocation book, actually. That was what I was asked to do. And on the Friday of the last day, the wife of the couple, during the break, walked up to me and she said, "Dr. Garber, I think that you've answered a question I've had for years in my life." And I looked at her, I'm thinking, well, what was the question? She said, "Well, I've been plagued by this question. I've asked, and I just don't know the relation between my life and my Christian life." And I looked at her and I said, "Well, what do you think it is now?" And she said, "They're the same thing, aren't they?" And I said, "That's exactly right." In my mind, to reintegrate is to, in some ways, to be part of, the mercy and the grace and the, gifts of God, help somebody realize that kind of dualism is false and it's destructive, actually. It doesn't help us at all to speak about my Christian life as if somehow it's different than my life, my regular life, actually. I think that the word reintegrate, obviously, it's maybe helpful to see it as not the same thing as disintegrate. It isn't the same thing as to fragment, is it? Which are both words which get at, breaking apart and, pushing away from and, unraveling. But reintegrate is to say, well, what would it look like to have this vision of a more coherent life? It's a good word, coherent. A more seamless life. It's another good word, I think. There's no magic word here. There's no particular word we have to use. But you're right. I've been interested in this idea for a long time. How do we hold together what we, the world that God made, our life in God's world, the way we live in God's world? How do we hold it all together more coherently, more seamlessly, in a way which, assumes the task of reintegration?
That word reintegrate is important to me, obviously. And I think I learned it a lot from you, so thank you for that. And obviously, this is a hard thing to do.
Yes.
Because we not only live in a broken world, but it's a disintegrated world, a world where things are just hard to do and life is hard to do. And we get frustrated because every time we try to do something, we run up against something that keeps us from being able to accomplish it. Now I'm in my midlife crisis, I think, and it's like I look back at these years and I go, oh, there's just so much I could have done, and I failed to do so. And I look forward to the coming years, and I just go, why? It's so hard. It's just so hard.
Right.
And so a word that you brought to my attention during our studies in the doctoral cohort was this word proximate. Can you help us understand how we can make peace with the proximate?
Right. Well, again, Bob, it's a very good question. It's a question from your heart as it is from mine. Having lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, I got a question several years ago from the editor of Comment magazine asking, would you write something for us about the vocation of politics? You've been watching politics a long time in Washington. Is there a vocation in the political world? And I spent actually a whole summer thinking about the question. Finally, I gave them an essay that I called Making Peace with Proximate Justice. And what I argued was that if you're going to stick with a vocation in the political world, you're going to have to learn to make peace with something, even if it isn't everything. It may be, you're at the purest, holiest motives to come to Washington, D.C. to try to bring about the justice of God in a pluralizing, secularizing, globalizing moment of history. It may be who you are. It could be some lesser motive than that. It could be, ambition. It could be fame. It could be wealth. It could be, my party. It could be my partisan ideology. Whatever it could be. But it could be, varieties of motivations. But if you're going to stay at it, stick with it. I argued in the essay, you'd have to learn to make peace with proximate justice, with some justice to be done, even if it wasn't everything that could be done and everything that ought to be done. We have in our founding documents, our founding ideas, phrases like e pluribus unum, out of the many one. Clearly, in the 21st century, in the year 2020, America, the whole world is bewildered watching us thinking, how is America unraveling like this right now? What's going on? This lead nation in the face of the earth for the last 100 years, it's just unraveling, it's imploding. What's going on? So we are fragmenting as a people. We are disintegrating as a people. We all feel that. What day of your life don't you walk into some room wondering, can I really honestly speak to this person about what I think is going on in the world? Or do I need to kind of hold my tongue here because I don't know what they might think? They might shoot me. They might yell at me. They might be really mad at me. Because, of course, we are so disunified. We're so disintegrated, Bob, in terms of our sense of belonging to and for each other as a people, as a nation. So for me, proximate is a word that allows us to keep living, even in the face of wound and hurt and sorrow and disintegration, because it doesn't require that all things happen, that all good things happen. It doesn't require that all justice be done in this moment in history. I've got a little grandson who's 5 years old, and his father, who's my son-in-law, sent me a little video a few days ago of him, talking with his son and talking through the phrase we all know so well, practice makes perfect, Grandpa, and he said, Grandpa, what we say in our house is practice makes proximate. It's pretty good.
You must have read your article in Comment magazine.
The little 5-year-old boy that he is, yes.
One of your lines is, how do I know the world and still love it? I just feel like a lot of people you're just getting to the point where they're fed up. And that's what's causing the disintegration. They're just fed up, and they don't want to have anything to do with anybody that doesn't believe what they believe or think the way they would think, or have ideology that they have. And so they become, I don't know, cynical of the other, hateful of the other. So where do you think we'll find that hope?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, really. And I'm just looking at you. I've not talked about these things with you the last days and weeks, Bob, but I'm thinking you're probably a lot like me, because I have hopes and I have histories, and and I find myself just more and more aware that we live in a very fragile moment in history right now, not just because of COVID-19 and all that we know and don't know about it, but fragile in terms of the disintegration of America. If Alexis de Tocqueville, the French Frenchman came to visit America in its first 50 years and wrote this great book, Democracy in America, and analyzing the habits of heart that not only made America America then, but would be required to hold in place if we were going to continue to be America into the future. We have largely lost sight of what was possible and needed as a people. And if Tocqueville didn't use these words, me and we can use them, and it gets at what Tocqueville did get at, what he did write about. And there's a critical relationship between me and we in every social, body, whether it is a marriage, a family, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a church, whether it's a university, an institution, an organization of some sort. It has to be somehow a way in which both are honored honestly at the same time, the me and the we. We've got 5 kids, none of them are adolescents anymore, but I remember when they were, and those were terrorizing days in some ways, and often it was because, one of the, emerging, young, adults, adolescents as they were, was determined to make the whole meal be about them. And this doesn't work really, because there has to be some way in which, for a healthy social ecology, me and we have to be held together. Always, really. And so, you watch what I watch, you listen to what I listen to, you read what I read, I'm sure, Bob, and, you are aware that keenly, plainly, very painfully right now, we are not very much e pluribus unum at all, actually. We are fragmented, disunified, we're disintegrated, we are fighting each other, we want to shoot each other, and with no sense really that there has to be a me and the we held together with honesty for there to be a healthy social ecology.
Steve, you use the word proximate a lot, and you elaborated on that in a way that was kind of illuminating for me, I think. You were talking about how we, as people, I think sometimes we tend to, at least the way I interpret it is that we tend to expect perfection perhaps where it's not possible. I like how your grandson is being taught, practice makes proximate instead of practice makes perfect, because I think, and I don't know if it's a human thing or more of a, a Western culture, more of an American thing. We tend to, I think, hold ourselves and hold other people and maybe even hold parts of our society to some sort of standard of perfection that isn't attainable. And I think I've kind of been asking myself that question. Do I hold myself to that standard in my own life? I know right now Bob, as you mentioned, is enjoying his midlife crisis. And I'm, I think, starting to enter my quarter life crisis. And it's, sort of a series of similar questions, because I know I'm at a stage in my life where I still have a level of, freedom and flexibility to make changes or make, kind of still steer the trajectory of my life without having to reorient a lot of other things. So I feel this pressure, am I getting this right? Am I walking the right path? Am I in the right direction? Because the longer I walk this path, the harder it'll be to get off of it. And, if I mess this up, if I stay in my job for too long, or if I leave my job too early, or if I go back to school and I, pick the wrong graduate degree or whatever, I feel this pressure, like I have to completely get it right, or it's not going to matter, or at least, it won't be good enough for God.
Yeah. So 2 weeks ago, J.I. Packer died. I don't know whether you have come across his work yet. Brad, I hope you will if you haven't at this point, but he was clearly a giant of theological wisdom in the last generation. And years ago, before he got to be in his 90s, which he did when he died last 2 weeks ago, but it was already clear to a lot of people, me being one of them, that his book, Knowing God, was going to be an honest classic passed on into the generations and to come. And I had the gift of getting to know him in my life and spending more time with him than I ever thought possible. And I recently just wrote 3 essays remembering J.I. Packer, reflecting on what I learned from him over the years of life. But in the book Knowing God, he has a chapter called God's Wisdom and Ours. And there are two images which have really shaped my thinking about your question for most of my life now, since I was your age, at least, and on over the years since then. But again, the chapter titled God's Wisdom and Ours. And he argues, that we may have misconceptions of what it means to be wise people if we actually, don't read the Bible carefully enough and read into it thinking, well, it must be saying this, but it really isn't saying that at all. And he says, imagine that you were a lover of railroad trains. And Packer was an Englishman. He says, imagine yourself at the York Railway Station. And you love trains. You never can get enough of trains because you just love trains so much, really. And the tracks are full of trains, and all the people are there, and trains are coming in and out of the station, and it's noisy, and you're just in love with the trains and all they represent to you. And all of a sudden, somebody bumps your elbow or takes you by the elbow and says, hey, I think you just love this, don't you? And you think, well, I really do, actually. He said, well, you want to see the whole train yard? Come up to the station tower with me. You can see everything, actually. You think, well, I've died and gone to heaven, and you walk up to the train tower and you can see how the tracks come in from miles in every direction, where this track goes, where it came from, and where the trains are. And you think, I've now seen everything. I know where it came from. I know where it's going. And Packer says, if we think it's like that to be a wise person, we're badly misreading the biblical vision of what it means to have the wisdom of God in our lives. He said, we're never promised that, to actually have this sense that, oh, you see, now I know because I did that, 5 years ago, and now this happened. Now I get it, okay? It happened like that for this. Oh, okay, now I see, really. And Packer argued, I think satisfactorily to me, that was a misreading of the Bible's teaching about the wisdom of God. He says it's actually much more like, imagine yourself not in the York Railway Station, but imagine yourself in a little English country lane, just, big enough for a small car and maybe a small little truck, and there's stone fences on both sides. And you can't really see where you're going, what's up beyond what you can see right in front of you. He said, the best you can do actually is make sure you don't get too close to the truck in front of you or get too close to the car behind you, and you stay on your side of the lane, because you have to adjust yourself, foot by foot and, 20 yard by 20 yard. And, as you go through the highway, you're having to make adjustments all the time, trying to figure out, so where am I now? And what do I have to do next to make sure that I get there? And he says that's much more what it means to have the wisdom of God in life. I would say, Brandon, that wisdom from J.I. Packer has shaped me in my life, especially in times when I've been in crisis, where I thought I tried to do the right thing and, praying the right prayers and having the right conversations and seeking the most godly wisdom from people I thought had it to give to me. And sometimes, even having done all that, it still didn't work out very well. And I'm thinking, well, what happened actually? How am I ever going to figure out my life, really, if I can't do the right thing and have the right thing happen? And I began to realize that promise was never my promise. That, in fact, for me, it was more, will you trust me to know that I will give light to your path? And actually, in fact, that it's much more like the English country lane, where you're trying to turn left and turn right, and keep out of the middle of the little road, and making sure you're not getting too close to the truck ahead of you and the car behind you, and doing your best to make the right adjustments, minute by minute, second by second, as you make your way through the highway. I think that's much more what you can be promised by God. And in some ways, it sets your heart free to realize that there's no ever a moment in your life where you're going to think, wow, now I've arrived. Now I know why I went to that university and changed from this to this and did that first job, because you see, now it all makes sense to me. I think that's really a fallacy, and it's a certain kind of foolishness, and that's not the promise of God.
For so many people, when they think about what is the ultimate purpose of life, the telos of life, and a lot of them are like, well, it's the afterlife, isn't it? This life really is, we just kind of have to muddle through this thing because this isn't all that important. What really is important is this life after this life, and therefore, but I don't sense that that's what you mean by telos.
No, it's not really, no. But you can see in some ways that's another version of the Australian good woman being perplexed over the difference between her Christian life and her regular life. In some ways she had eschatologically, to use a $1,000 word here, eschatologically so defined, what, my Christian life was all about. Not about this life, actually. It's about something beyond this life, beyond having ordinary things to do in this world, that she was in some ways missing the point of this life. She was failing to actually understand what this life was about because she was misreading, the telos of her life.
That's the invigorating part of what you teach, Steve, is the fact that we have a vocation here and now, and the vocation isn't just to bide our time until we get to heaven. It is actually to live a full Christian life as a precursor to that life in the future. But it gives meaning and purpose to why we're here beyond the fact. You talked about having that dualistic view of things, that the only things that are important are the things that aren't really of this world in the life that I live right now. And so if we can help people understand and begin to enjoy this life, even though we can only get proximate to the fullness of what life should be, but knowing that future fullness of life that is promised us,
right,
to try to bring some of that future into the present. That's the eschatological life that you're talking about, isn't it?
It is. That's exactly right, Bob.
Well, thanks for coming, Steve. We really appreciate it.
It's good to see you. Good to meet you, Brandon. Blessings on your labors of love together here. So,
thanks.
Thank you, Steve. It was great meeting you as well.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Reintegrate podcast. We'd love for you to come back again next week. If you like Reintegrate, please write a quick review at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app to encourage others to listen too. Be sure to check out Reintegrate's various ministries at re-integrate.org. Remember the dash. At the webpage, you'll find years' worth of articles on reintegrating your callings with God's mission, resources for further learning, links to the Reintegrate YouTube channel, and more. On the podcast page, you'll find ways to email us or call us to comment on this podcast. You can call our voicemail line with your comments on this phone number, 234-207-5409. Try to limit your recordings to 30 to 45 seconds. We may play it on the podcast. You can also email your comments on the podcast to this email address, comment@re-integrate.org. We could read your comment on the show as well.